All right, hello everyone. So now we're going to be talking about the welfare implications of the monopoly market setting. So we're going to use this concept of social surplus to think about the social welfare attached to leaving this monopoly market to its own devices. We used that topic previously in Unit 2 when we were trying to develop this idea of supply and demand. And at least implicitly, we were thinking about supply and demand, social surplus, consumer and producer surplus. Implicitly, we had kind of made it a sort of assumption about the market as being a perfectly competitive market environment, right? And this will become a little bit clearer to you as we move on. So let me just continue with this. All right, so remember we developed these curves of supply and demand, and we said the supply curve is upward sloping because the marginal cost curve is increasing, and so as firms as consumers demand more and more output, the firm's going to say, well, I want a higher price because my marginal cost is increasing to produce that output, right? The demand curve, we've talked about it being downward sloping. There's three principal mechanisms. But we also kind of conceptualized the supply curve as the marginal cost curve, right? As essentially being the marginal cost curve, and the demand curve as being the marginal benefit or marginal revenue curve. So implicitly, you can see that this kind of assumed perfect competition because there was this marrying of the demand curve with this marginal revenue curve, and this kind of becomes disjointed in the monopoly market, right? So when we were thinking about governmental interventions in markets, we are implicitly working with a perfectly competitive market, right? And we always said that a government could do, they were kind of like the boogeyman in some sense for some of us. If they instituted a price floor that was binding, or they instituted a price ceiling that was binding, we would arrive at a situation in which there was deadweight loss. And so let's use maybe a minimum wage as an example. So maybe the market clearing wage is $8, and then this is a minimum wage of $15. We said that we would expect, deadweight loss, right? A loss in market transactions, and in the minimum wage example, this would decrease in employment. We said essentially all government was good for doing in Unit 2 was rearranging the social surplus, right? From an efficiency perspective, government made the market inefficient. They added this extra component of deadweight loss to the market. All they could do is take some of the surplus from either producers and consumers and rearrange them and give them to producers or consumers. But as a whole, you would end up with less social surplus, right? So in this market, everything beneath the demand curve and above the price is consumer surplus. And let's say this is the market for labor. And then everything below the price, but above the supply curve, is going to be producer surplus, which I'll put in green. In this market, however, the demanders or the consumers are firms and the suppliers are workers. So compared to the market clearing equilibrium point, we see a rearranging of like surplus. We see deadweight loss eating into total surplus, but we see a rearranging of surplus such that now it seems like producer surplus at least gets some of that consumer surplus. Right, and so we did this, and we said we would arrive at a deadweight loss, right? We would be essentially shrinking the total social surplus, but implicitly we're assuming a perfectly competitive model. So surplus, just to refresh your brain, is this idea that there were people. Let me just make sure that's the last thing I wanted to say about this. Oh yes, and remember we thought of a per unit tax and we shifted the supply curve and we said S plus tax, and we said that there was a disjuncture between the price buyers received and the price sellers received, the price buyers paid. We talked about binding price ceilings, which are below the equilibrium point, and we always ended up with deadweight loss with governmental intervention. Now, we're going to use these concepts of consumer and producer surplus to wrap our heads around the social implications or the welfare implications of the monopoly market. And consumer surplus, just a reminder, the kind of idea behind consumer surplus is that there were people and consumers in this market that were willing to pay, right? So we can actually go to the demand curve, go across and find the quantity that were willing to pay a higher price, but instead they get this price, right, of $18. Right? There were people in this market that were willing to pay maybe $20, but instead they get to pay $18, right? And so that's it's a tool that economists use to think about the welfare implications of models or of markets. And then producer surplus, it's the same logic. This monopolist would have been willing to supply the good at lower price points, granted with varying quantity, but at lower price points, but they didn't have to. They got to supply it at 18. I'd say we see consumer and producer surplus in this model right here. But we also see something else, right? We see deadweight loss, right? And this idea, right? We talked about market power in the previous video, that we are going to think about market power as the ability for the monopolist to charge a price above marginal cost. And we can see that ability leads to deadweight loss, right? There are people that would have been willing to buy this good above marginal costs. And in a perfectly competitive market, there would have been suppliers that would have been willing to supply those goods as long as they were above marginal costs. But now, because this monopolist, or because this market is owned by a single firm, right? A single firm operates in this market, we end up with deadweight loss. There's no supplying of these goods above the marginal cost curve for this firm, right? So this is significant, right? This is a significant moment because, if we left this market alone, this is an example of what we call a market failure. We're going to be talking about market failure a lot for the duration of this class. For me, this is exciting. It's a, it's kind of like our class, our AP Microeconomics class can now begin to marry concepts with our AP Government class that we worked with, because this really signals that there's potentially a role for policy in sort of rectifying this market failure. But a market failure is an environment in which market equilibrium does not maximize social welfare, right? So leaving this market to its own devices, social welfare is not maximized. Social welfare is maximized at the point at which marginal cost or if the quantity at the point at which marginal cost and the demand curve intersect is produced. That's when social welfare is maximized, but we can see here that there is a lot of people that would have been willing to pay above the marginal cost, that in a perfectly competitive market, they would have been serviced but are not because of this monopoly. So this is significant, right? So we're at a first market failure. So maybe there's a role for governmental intervention. We'll talk about that as we transition to the back. So there's one thing that I should say. Sorry, I'm getting my markers. This messes back, so I have to give away this board too. So I'm losing my baby. But we made an assumption about the monopolist when we were looking at the social welfare implications that I need to make a little bit more explicit, right? We assumed that the monopolist couldn't price discriminate. And we had talked about price discriminating yesterday, and we found that there were a variety of firms that actually engage in price discrimination. But that assumption is what leads to the deadweight, or that assumption allows us to kind of, or probably leads to a larger deadweight loss, or not to a larger deadweight loss. That assumption allowed us to see the deadweight loss associated with, a single price, right? Assuming that the monopolist couldn't charge people different prices. But a monopolist can price discriminate, right? So this is an example of a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. Again, perfectly, there's no such thing as a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. A few have tried to be perfectly price discriminating, and I'll talk about Amazon in a bit. But again, in economics, we study extremes so we can understand the range of possibility that actually exists in reality. And so we can see in this scenario, social welfare is maximized. And the way that this monopolist would do this, if they were perfectly price discriminating, is they would charge this quantity of people, right? They would go to the demand curve and find these people that demanded whatever this good that they're selling or service that they're selling is at that price point and sell it to them there. And they would do that continuously, right? So they would find the people that demanded this good or service at that price point, and they would sell it there, and so on and so forth. And so in this scenario, the monopolist is social welfare maximizing. However, all our social welfare is producer surplus. There's no consumer surplus. And so this maybe is kind of a hint at that thing that I was talking about social surplus being kind of an inadequate or imperfect measure of the social welfare associated with markets, right? If it's all producer surplus, then I mean, we're maximizing social surplus, but it's all producer surplus, then I mean, what good is that? And so some examples of price discriminating, we're going to read an article. Let me see if I can get it. We're going to read parts of an article, I think on Friday, about Amazon trying to charge different prices based on your IP address. So like if you're a student, so how online shopping makes suckers of us all. This was from 2017. I guess there was some sort of legal dispute and Amazon was barred from doing this. So we're going to talk about that on Friday, right? So the idea was that you could price discriminate against potentially students, right? If you knew that the person was a student, you could maybe charge them a different price for textbooks than people that weren't students. If you knew that person was a student that was purchasing the textbook in mid-September, so purchasing the textbook a bit late, then you can charge them potentially even a higher price. And so that's an example of price discrimination. We also talked about price discrimination happens and firms price discriminate significantly in imperfectly competitive markets, not just monopolies. And so you gave me examples of price discrimination, like price discrimination against like happy hour is an example of price discrimination. And the idea is that to sort of take into account the elasticity of demand, maybe of the market at different times, or of individual consumers, and to discriminate and offer different prices based on that to maximize profit or revenue, or profit, yeah, profit to maximize profit. Okay. Oh, the other thing that I forgot to say is that monopolist's ability to charge above marginal cost, that's what we call a markup. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, other stories this model can tell. This is where we talk about elasticities. And so this is going to be like sort of the new content for today. And then let me look at the back so I can see what else we have. Okay, so there are different stories this model can tell. So I have this ATC curve and this marginal cost curve. Maybe this is the long run ATC curve. It doesn't matter. And this is the long run marginal cost curve. At this point, the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the demand curve, this is where we call the allocatively efficient point. It's the quantity where price actually equals marginal costs. Oh, wait, hold on. Yeah, where the quantity where price equals the marginal cost for producing that good or service. That's the allocatively efficient point. We talked about how, like in a perfectly competitive environment, this is in this sort of market, that would be the point at which consumers and producers, that would be the market equilibrium point. Of course, there's deadweight loss in monopolies. So QE is the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, and maybe we can draw a PE to represent the equilibrium price. Another thing, right, when we were developing our models last time, we said firm exit and entry. We talked about that, and we said that in the short run, there may be profits in a perfectly competitive model, but in the long run, we said economic profits will always be pushed to zero because more firms would enter, some would leave. And we said that firms would then be forced to eventually produce that stayed in the market at their productively efficient point, right? So they would be forced to produce at the minimum of their ATC curves in a perfectly competitive environment. And that would be the productively efficient point. So QP, we would go all the way up to the ATC curve, is going to be the productively efficient point that we could represent here. Now, of course, if you're a monopolist, there's barriers to entry for whatever reason. And so firms are not going to be able to enter and exit the market, or maybe eventually, but generally no. So the monopolist isn't going to produce at this point, but in a perfectly competitive environment, they would, in the long run, be forced to produce at the productively efficient point. Right, that's where the maximum quantity at the minimum cost. That's where, or the minimum cost, or perfect competition forces firms to produce at the cost minimizing point, which is at where the slope of the ATC curve is zero. Okay, and then what else? What other story can we tell? Oh yes, we can also go, and this, I'm going to probably have to take this part a little slow. We can also go from the intersection of the marginal revenue curve. At this point, this is probably going to involve me actually, hello. Hello, ma'am. It's going to be 3. At this point, right, where the marginal revenue curve touches the x-axis, that is going to be where total revenue is actually maximized. And so this is probably going to involve that math video that I promised in part 1 of this, I suppose, series. It's going to involve me showing the relationship between the total revenue function and the demand curve and the marginal revenue function, and in trying to sort of approximate marginal revenue with algebra, and then at the end of the video showing you with calculus. But at this point, we can actually go all the way up to the demand curve, and we're going to say that at this point, this is going to be the unit elastic point. And remember your elasticities from unit 1 or unit 2. We said that the elasticity of a demand curve changes, right? And we said that generally things higher up the demand curve are going to be more elastic than things lower the demand curve are going to be inelastic. Well, we can actually find the range of elasticity that exists on this demand curve if we know where the marginal revenue curve is, or the marginal revenue curve intersects the x-axis. We would just go all the way up to the demand curve. Everything above that is going to be elastic, and everything below that is going to be inelastic. Okay, so another way to think about this is, why is this happening? Well, everything below this is essentially this demand curve. The marginal revenue is negative, right? And we said that when we were talking about revenue functions, or when we were talking about the relationship between elasticity and revenue, we said that if you lowered the price of something that was inelastic, you would lose total revenue, right? We said that if you lower the price of something that was inelastic, you would lose total revenue. And so that makes sense as to why we think about, this part of the demand curve being inelastic, because as we're, lowering the price in this range, we're losing total revenue, right? But as we raise the price in this range, our marginal revenue increases, and we're increasing total revenue, right? So the same logic holds for up here as we go above this demand curve. If we increase the price, I'm sorry, this is going to represent the range where marginal revenue is greater than 0, right? And we can think about it in terms of, if you decrease the price, right? Consumers are sensitive to demand, and they're going to be responsive to that decrease in price, and therefore your marginal revenue is going to be increasing, right? Likewise, if you increase the price, consumers are also going to be responsive to that, and your marginal revenue is going to be decreasing, right? So we can actually find the point at which the elasticity of this monopolist demand curve is unit elastic, inelastic, and elastic. It's pretty cool. You can tell a lot of different stories with this monopoly model. All right, finally, we're going to talk about why monopolies come into being. And so, how do monopolies arise? So monopolies can be natural. I know a lot of people think that they come from like a ruthless type of organization, right? A lot of you said that they were linked to political corruption in the United States, or were implying that. But monopolies can be natural in the sense that our marginal cost curve, or a natural monopoly takes place when, for all relevant quantities, one firm can produce at a lower average cost than other firms. So maybe there's economies of scale for all quantities that are demanded. We're going to relate this to a concept that we learned in Unit 3 when we talked about minimum efficient scale and thinking about market concentration. So all relevant quantities would be like the quantity that's actually demanded, right? And so a good example of this would be a water utility. Well, let's think about it, right? So what this really means is like, or the reason why this can take place, right? We can have an average cost curve that seems to be, downward sloping for all relevant quantities. This is probably a long run. This is a long run average cost curve, right? It seems to have economies of scale for all relevant quantities, and a flat marginal cost curve would be an environment in which maybe you have a lot of fixed costs, right? Like huge fixed costs, and then your marginal cost is like trivial compared to those fixed costs, or just, trivial in general, right? And so in that environment, you would expect a natural monopoly. So an example of this would be like a water utility or utilities in general, where you have huge fixed costs of maybe maybe a nuclear power plant, for example, you know, or let's just go with water utility. Sorry, I have it written there. You have a huge fixed cost of like laying down the pipes. That's massive. And so it's just getting divided over increasing output. And so for a long period of time, the average cost curve seems to be just downward sloping or to kind of almost hug the marginal cost curve for all relevant quantities. I mean, at some point, yeah, at some quantity, it's going to begin to be upward sloping, but maybe that quantity is never going to actually feasibly be demanded in the market. And the marginal cost of a water utility is just the cost of water, right? Once you lay down the pipes, you really don't have a lot of substantial marginal costs associated with it. And so the first firm that lays down the pipes, has a monopoly in this market. Now, if you think about entrance and exit in this market, if you tried to enter in this market, what's going to happen? Well, the monopolist could, in theory, as you're further along the average cost curve, just say, okay, I'm going to price them out of the market. I'm just going to produce at a price that is barely above marginal cost, and that firm would just be bleeding money and they would have to leave the market. Right. So I have a little cute Valentine's Day meme that I'll share with you guys in class today about natural monopolies. Right. So it's for all relevant quantities. The average cost curve is decreasing. There's economies of scale that seems to continue not ad infinitum, but at least over the relevant range of output. And the marginal cost could be trivial and actually not seem increasing, but be relatively flat. I would say not necessarily a slope of zero, but a slope pretty close. And then another way monopolies can arise is like government action, so like patents, copyright laws. And so governments can actually, purposely create monopolies, and they can do this for a range of reasons. We're going to talk about pharmaceutical companies probably tomorrow. But the idea is that if you have a good idea, that governments want to reward that good idea by granting you a monopoly for some duration of time in order to incentivize people to come up with those types of ideas, right? So in an environment in which patents don't exist, right? And maybe this relates to like social surplus being an inadequate measure of, social benefit or welfare from markets. In an environment in which patents don't exist, someone could invent this life-saving drug, and everyone would be able to produce it in their labs or in the garage or whatnot. Or maybe an artist can develop like this wonderful work of literature, but not receive any benefit from it, right? Maybe somebody else can like print out the issue of his book, right? So patents are, specific type of governmental action that create monopoly markets, right? So monopolies exist because of barriers to entry, and those barriers to entry can be natural in the form of a huge fixed cost and a firm getting there first. And so it's just inconceivable to think of another firm entering that market, or in the form of like patents and copyright. There's other monopolies that take place for supposedly strategic reasons, that governments have monopolies over specific industries for strategic and political reasons, and we can get into that later. So how do you fix monopolies? Well, here we can actually talk about governmental regulations less action. So with market failures, there's room for policy making to think about rectifying these types of market failures. And so a price ceiling in Unit 2, it led to an inefficient outcome, but in a perfect world where the government has knowledge about the demand curve that a monopoly market has, the marginal revenue curve, and where the monopolist is transparent about their marginal costs, and all of those things are not something that exists at the back of an envelope, right? It takes a lot of analysis and a lot of trust between those organizations and a lot of capability and capacity. A government could set a perfect price ceiling, right? They could tell the monopolists, essentially you have to produce at this price ceiling such that they essentially, get rid of this deadweight loss, right? If the government installs a price ceiling right here and the monopolist can't produce, at their profit maximizing price, then they're going to produce at this equilibrium, and social surplus would be actually maximized, right? The monopolist would be producing at a point where the marginal cost equals the demand curve and at its allocatively efficient point. This assumes a lot of knowledge, so it's probably a bit unrealistic, right? This is what makes public economics so interesting and fun. Another way is to introduce competition. We'll talk more about this later. All right, I'm going to end the video.